Back in the days when automakers weren't afraid to gamble on crazy ideas, a few prototypes rolled out that left everyone wondering what the designers were thinking. They were weird, awkward, and sometimes a little frightening to look at. Here are 10 old experimental cars that probably should have never seen the light of day. The 1956 Ford Predicta was one of those wild mid-century experiments that perfectly captured the optimism of the era, yet also showed just how far ahead of practicality designers were willing to go. In the mid-1950s, every big American automaker wanted to be the company that showed the future. Jet-age styling, space-age gadgetry, tail fins like rocket boosters, and dashboards that looked like they came off a sci-fi movie set. This was the atmosphere the Predicta was born into. Ford wanted something dramatic, something that would stop people in their tracks at auto shows, and they found their showpiece in the form of a car with a fully transparent bubble roof that promised tomorrow but delivered something closer to a sauna on wheels. The bubble canopy looked breathtaking under show lights. It had that sleek, hovering arc of clear plastic that made the car feel more like a spaceship than a sedan. People crowding around Ford's displays in 1956 couldn't help staring at it. The roof was meant to symbolize the future of motoring, a world where cars were quiet, bright, airy, and gave drivers a panoramic view of the horizon. It was the ultimate extension of the jet-age dream, a gesture saying that transportation would one day break free from old limitations and embrace the freedom of open skies. But all that transparency came with a very simple problem: sunlight. Once the canopy was closed, the sun didn't just shine in, it poured in, relentlessly, with nowhere to go. The heat trapped inside built quickly, turning the Predicta into a rolling terrarium. Test drivers found themselves sweating through their shirts within minutes, their arms sticking to the seats, their faces flushed as though they were sitting inside a parked car on a summer afternoon with all the windows sealed. One driver joked that being inside the Predicta felt like waiting to be steamed for dinner. And comments like that traveled fast through Ford's development halls. No amount of early ventilation technology could handle that much glass overhead. Air conditioning was not yet powerful, widespread, or reliable enough to keep the cabin livable. Even with vents open and fans running, the Predicta stubbornly kept its identity as a mobile greenhouse. Ford engineers tried to work around the problem. They experimented with tinting, airflow channels, and even partial shading, but none of it solved the core issue. The canopy trapped heat far faster than any system of the time could remove it, and the summer sun made the interior temperature skyrocket before the car even left the parking lot. Test sessions that should have lasted hours sometimes ended in 10 or 15 minutes because drivers simply couldn't take it anymore. They would step out of the vehicle red-faced, drenched, and shaking their heads. Some reportedly refused to get back inside for a second run unless the car had been sitting in the shade for an hour first. Practicality wasn't the only issue. The canopy also caused severe glare. Sunlight bounced off chrome trim, dashboard edges, and even the driver's own shoulders. It created reflections, distortions, and bright pockets of refracted light that made visibility unpredictable and distracting. In the right angle, a driver could be blinded by light hitting the bubble just so. The whole idea, intended to improve visibility, ended up compromising it. Beyond the heat and glare, the bubble roof created an uncomfortable sense of enclosure. Unlike a normal car interior, the Predicta made drivers feel as though they were being displayed, sitting in a glass dome with no privacy at all. Every passerby could see you, from the tilt of your head to the sweat beading on your forehead. There was no hiding inside a bubble, You were the exhibit. Car reviewers of the time were not kind about the lack of shade or the theater-like exposure. After enough testing, Ford quietly admitted defeat. The Predicta was a wonderful dream, a beautiful showpiece, and a perfect slice of 1950s imagination, but it had no real future on the road. The bubble roof made it something closer to an oven than a car, and the problems it presented were impossible to overcome with the technology of the time. Ford didn't want to sell a vehicle that cooked its occupants, so the idea never made it past the experimental stage. Today, the 1956 Ford Predicta is remembered as one of those glorious, bold concept cars that illustrates both the ambition and the naivete of the era. It looked like the future, but it lived like a warning. It represents that moment in American automotive history when designers were willing to push boundaries even when the laws of physics and comfort pushed back. For older car enthusiasts who recall the stories, the Predicta is a nostalgic reminder of those hopeful days when every auto show felt like a glimpse of tomorrow, even if tomorrow turned out to need a lot more shade.
The 1957 Cadillac Cyclone was one of those glittering, outrageous visions of the future that could only have been born in the golden age of American optimism, when every engineer seemed convinced that the highway of tomorrow would look more like a runway at Cape Canaveral. In those years, Americans were dreaming about rockets, satellites, and space travel long before any of it became reality. And Cadillac, always eager to present itself as the pinnacle of progress, decided to build a car that looked like it had already returned from orbit. What emerged was the Cyclone, a sleek silver bullet with two huge black nose cones jutting from the front end like the business end of a guided missile. Cadillac called them radar sensors, meant to help the car avoid collisions automatically. To the public, though, they looked like props from a science fiction film, and the whole car took on an appearance that was half spaceship, half cartoon. People seeing the Cyclone for the first time were often caught between amazement and laughter. The proportions were extreme in a way no production car ever could be. The long, needle-like nose with those oversized cones made it look ready to lift off rather than roll down Main Street. Cadillac's designers tried to emphasize the futuristic technology behind the shape, proudly explaining how these sensors would one day allow cars to detect obstacles and apply the brakes automatically. To the public, though, they looked like props from a science fiction film, and the whole car took on an appearance that was half spaceship, half cartoon. The supposed radar system never actually worked. Cadillac didn't have the electronics to make such a device function reliably in real driving conditions, and the few demonstrations they attempted were little more than staged theatrics. The cones were hollow shells with impressive-looking trim and futuristic language wrapped around them, but no real capability inside. The running joke at auto shows was that the cones were only good for knocking over trash cans if you got too close. Visitors poked fun at them, calling the Cyclone a kid's rocket ship toy that had somehow grown to full size. Some people thought it looked like a carnival ride. Others compared it to those plastic nose cones you'd see on toy rockets sold at dime stores. Cadillac wanted awe, but they got chuckles. Yet beneath the humor was a certain charm. Older people who remember seeing the Cyclone describe it as the perfect snapshot of its time, a moment when car companies truly believed they could predict the future by adding a little space-age polish. The Cyclone had a bubble canopy that slid back like the cockpit of a jet fighter when the doors opened. It had gleaming silver bodywork that seemed almost liquid under bright lights. Even the tail fin treatment, restrained compared to later Cadillacs, hinted at jet nozzles and exhaust ports. Everything about the car was shaped to sell an idea that luxury didn't need chrome and comfort alone, it needed imagination. Cadillac wanted to show it was bold, adventurous, and unafraid to embrace the impossible. Inside, the Cyclone felt like a set from a futuristic movie, with smooth surfaces, an unusually open cabin, and an emphasis on visibility. But the bubble top, for all its sleek appearance, created its own problems. Like many concepts of the era, it turned the interior into a heated capsule under strong sunlight. Even Cadillac's test drivers ended up sweating through their suits, fanning themselves while trying to keep a straight face for promotional photos. "It's wonderful for display, but you wouldn't want to drive it past noon," one engineer reportedly joked. Despite all this, the Cyclone wasn't a joke to Cadillac, at least not at first. They genuinely believed they were showing the public the next steps in automotive luxury. Safety sensors, jet-inspired aerodynamics, and futuristic styling were all meant to demonstrate that Cadillac wasn't just following trends, it was leading them. But after the press and the public laughed more than they applauded, Cadillac quietly realized that the Cyclone was too far removed from any realistic production model. There was no way to soften the nose cones without losing the car's identity. And without real technology behind them, they were nothing more than dramatic decoration. So, the 1957 Cadillac Cyclone remained a one-off prototype, rolling back into storage after its show tour, its story turning into a footnote in the long history of mid-century optimism. Today, people look back at it with a mix of affection and amusement. It's remembered not as a failure, but as a delightful symbol of a time when car companies genuinely believed the future would be sleek, silver, and slightly ridiculous, and when even the most luxurious brand in America wasn't afraid to bolt a pair of giant toy rockets on the nose of a concept car just to make the world dream a little bigger.
The 1960 Chrysler XNR was one of those rare machines that almost seemed to exist out of sheer stubborn imagination, as if an engineer had suddenly decided that symmetry was overrated and the future belonged to cars that leaned, pointed, and sliced through the air like rebellious sculptures. Designed by the brilliant and endlessly expressive Virgil Exner, the XNR wasn't just unusual, it was downright defiant. Long, low, and sharp, its body looked like it had been pulled straight from a comic book cover about a daring test pilot who refused to drive anything ordinary. The detail that everyone remembers, of course, is that wild, towering fin slanting sharply to one side of the car, a surface so bold and so visually exaggerated that people walking around it at auto shows often stood still for a moment, trying to decide whether the car was pointing at them or leaning away. Exner believed that asymmetry could actually improve aerodynamics, directing airflow around the driver the way a fighter plane's tail fin did in the sky. On paper, the concept was bold and brave. In person, the XNR looked like a machine that had been caught mid-turn and then frozen in time. The single offset headrest bulge rose behind the driver's seat like a helmet waiting for its pilot. The fin behind it seemed to continue the line of that imaginary helmet upward into the air. Parked next to ordinary sedans of 1960, the XNR appeared almost alien. People whispered that it looked like a speedboat missing its lake. Others joked that if you leaned too far left inside the cockpit, the whole thing might tip over. But the real surprise came once the engineers began putting it on the road.
The XNR was built around a lively slant-six engine that had been tuned well beyond its usual mild manners, giving the car more punch than anyone expected. Yet no matter how quick it felt in a straight line, there was no escaping the unnatural sensation of the car's unbalanced shape. Drivers reported that it didn't quite feel planted, the airflow tugging at the off-center fin and creating subtle steering quirks that made the car seem indecisive in fast curves. Even at moderate speeds, the long nose wanted to wander, and the breeze pushed the tall fin like a hand nudging a weather vane. Chrysler's test drivers, a group that had bravely piloted all sorts of odd prototypes, came back from early sessions shrugging their shoulders and shaking their heads. One of them supposedly muttered, "Now we know why people build cars the normal way." From the cabin, things felt even stranger. With a single seat sitting slightly off-center, the driver had the odd sensation of not being aligned with the car's nose. The world rushed past in a way that felt skewed, as if the car were permanently looking just a little to the right. The controls worked, the engine sang, and the steering responded. But the balance, that natural harmony you subconsciously expect from any car, was missing. It was like standing on a beautiful staircase where one step is just slightly too tall. You could climb it, but you never forgot that something wasn't quite right. Despite all this, the XNR drew crowds everywhere it went. Its dramatic profile looked like pure motion even when sitting still, and that tall asymmetrical fin became the talk of every show it appeared in. People admired the bravery and creativity behind it, even as they quietly admitted they would never want to drive it on a windy day. Virgil Exner himself stood proudly beside it, explaining his aerodynamic theories and wishing that Chrysler management would approve a limited run. But executives, after seeing the test reports and hearing the complaints about stability, politely declined. They understood that the XNR was a magnificent sculpture, not a practical machine for real roads. And so the 1960 Chrysler XNR remained a lonely vision, a rolling experiment that proved both the brilliance and the limits of bold design. Today, it survives as one of the most striking concept cars ever created, a reminder that innovation sometimes means discovering not what works, but what absolutely does not. It stands tall, fin and all, as a monument to the exhilarating moment in American car history when designers weren't afraid to try something so dramatic, so unconventional, and so gloriously impractical that even engineers walked away saying, "Well, we'll stick to symmetry after all."
The 1962 AMC M422 concept was one of those strange moments in automotive history when a company, desperate to fill every possible niche, convinced itself that two completely different ideas could be fused into one tidy little package. On paper, AMC wanted a car that could serve families during the week and small businesses on weekends. A practical, compact machine that could haul goods yet still fit into tight suburban driveways. But when the engineers finished the prototype and rolled it outside for the first time, what stood before them looked less like a clever hybrid and more like a confused experiment. Short, tall, and painfully boxy, the M422 had the charm of a utility shed perched on four small wheels. People who saw it in person joked that it must have been designed with a ruler and a lunchbox. Driving it was even stranger. Because the body was so tall and the track so narrow, the M422 felt top-heavy the moment the driver eased it onto the road. At low speeds, it waddled and swayed like a grocery cart loaded with paint cans. But once the driver reached anything resembling highway velocity, the little concept began to tremble.
AMC test drivers reported that the body shuddered continuously, as if it were begging to slow down. One of them supposedly said that the faster you drove, the more the M422 seemed to think about its life choices. Any gust of wind could send it drifting toward the shoulder, and when trucks passed by, the air pressure pushed the tall sides like a sail, nudging the whole vehicle sideways. Cornering was another adventure entirely. The combination of a short wheelbase, a high roofline, and soft suspension made the M422 tilt dramatically in turns. At moderate speed, it leaned as though trying to see what was happening on the sidewalk. Push it harder, and the whole body threatened to roll over onto its side like a startled farm animal. AMC engineers, who were used to building quirky but honest small cars, quickly realized that no amount of suspension tweaking could fully tame the physics of a shoebox balanced on wheels. Even gentle suburban left turns had the prototype groaning and shifting its weight in unpredictable ways. Test drivers learned to grip the wheel tightly and take every corner with the caution normally reserved for icy roads. Inside, the cabin didn't help. Because the vehicle was meant to be both a car and a cargo hauler, the seating position was awkwardly upright, and the driver sat closer to the windshield than felt natural. The lack of insulation made the interior echo like an empty container, so every vibration, every panel rattle, every shiver of the chassis sounded amplified. Drivers described it as sitting inside a rumbling delivery bin. And when turning or braking, the tall body swayed enough that even passengers could feel the floor shift beneath their feet, as if the whole machine were flexing under stress. Perhaps the most telling moment came when AMC's own executives took turns trying it out. After a few test drives, the verdict was unanimous. The M422 handled so poorly that it was dangerous, even by early 60s standards. Engineers admitted that the design simply pushed a compact chassis far beyond what it could safely support. The concept was quietly shelved, the single prototype set aside like an embarrassing science project that proved an important lesson. Just because you can combine two ideas doesn't mean they'll behave once the wheels start turning. Today, the 1962 AMC M422 concept exists mostly as a cautionary tale and a footnote in AMC's long history of creative risks. It represents a moment when imagination outpaced practicality, when a company tried to stretch the definition of a compact car so far that the result nearly toppled over. But it also captures the charm of that era, a time when American car makers weren't afraid to experiment, even if the results sometimes shook, swayed, wobbled, and ultimately reminded everyone why certain shapes are better left for bread boxes than automobiles.
The 1963 Studebaker's Scepter was one of those tragic examples of a car that looked perfect in sketches, dazzled in early drawings, and then fell apart the moment rubber met the road. When the design team first imagined it, they pictured a sleek, modern coupe that might save Studebaker from the financial cliff it was rapidly approaching. The hood stretched out elegantly, the roofline dipped gracefully toward the rear, and the whole shape suggested confidence, sophistication, and one last burst of glory from a company running out of breath. But when the prototype rolled into the daylight, the illusion began to fade almost immediately. The first problem was the steering. That long, stylish hood that looked so impressive in photos ended up placing a huge amount of weight on the front wheels. Without modern power steering, or even a well-tuned manual setup, the Scepter was a chore to handle at low speeds. Test drivers joked that parking it felt like wrestling a stubborn bull. Every slow turn required both hands, locked elbows, and a bit of upper body commitment.
Even once it was moving, the steering never quite settled. It felt vague, as if the front end were floating ahead of the driver, slightly disconnected from reality. On winding roads, the car wandered just enough to make drivers nervous, as though it were unsure of its own path. Inside, things didn't get better. The concept had a promising interior design, but the execution was rushed, thin and shaky. Every bump in the road triggered a small orchestra of rattles, clicks, buzzes, and metallic tapping. Dash panels vibrated, door frames chirped, and the rear trim occasionally let out a sharp rattle that sounded like someone shaking a coffee can full of screws. Test drivers described the interior as alive, but not in a good way, more like it was falling apart in real time. The prototype simply wasn't built with the precision or materials needed to make its impressive style feel solid. Studebaker's financial struggles were showing everywhere. They couldn't afford the kind of development time a car like this needed. They couldn't afford new manufacturing equipment. They couldn't afford extra rounds of testing, refinement, or reinforcement. By 1963, the company was patching holes, stretching budgets, and hoping desperately for a miracle. The Scepter was supposed to be that miracle, bold enough to attract buyers, fresh enough to revive the brand, and modern enough to compete with Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Instead, the prototype revealed how exhausted the company truly was. Underneath the pretty sheet metal, the engineering felt unfinished. The ride was uneven, with the rear suspension bouncing sharply over rough pavement. The engine tuning was inconsistent, and the transmission had a clumsy, hesitant feel. Even the doors didn't close cleanly. They required an extra shove, and they still rattled when shut, a clear sign of a rushed, low-budget build. Studio lighting at auto shows made the Scepter look like a futuristic savior. Real-world testing revealed it was a fragile dream held together with hope and thin resources. When Studebaker executives evaluated the prototype, they immediately understood what it meant. They didn't have the time, money, or stability to fix the problems. The Scepter wasn't just another concept. It was a painful reminder that Studebaker was nearing the end. The car had potential, yes, but potential alone wasn't enough to keep a company alive. The dream of saving Studebaker with one stylish new model died quietly the same year, sealed with the knowledge that even their boldest ideas were now beyond their reach. Today, the 1963 Studebaker Scepter stands as a bittersweet symbol. A beautiful sketch turned into a fragile prototype at the very moment its maker was collapsing. Older enthusiasts remember it not just as a concept car, but as the final breath of a proud American automaker. It had the looks of a savior, the heart of a company in decline, and the rattling, unfinished feeling of a dream that simply couldn't survive.
The 1964 Ford Aurora safety car was one of those well-meaning ideas that started with good intentions and ended with a prototype so clumsy and strange that people still remember it more for its shape than its mission. Ford wanted to prove that safety could be stylish, that technology could protect families, and that the future of driving didn't have to be dangerous. Engineers filled it with safety belts, padded dashboards, impact-absorbing structures, and all sorts of clever ideas meant to make crashes less deadly. But the moment the public laid eyes on the Aurora, all that noble effort got buried under the simple, unavoidable fact that the car looked like a rolling marshmallow drifting slowly down the road. The body was swollen and oddly rounded in every direction. Designers avoided sharp edges for the sake of safety, which left the Aurora looking soft, bulbous, and almost cartoonishly puffy.
It had wide, chubby fenders, a swollen roofline, and panels that curved outward so gently they looked half melted. People joked that if you parked it near a campfire, someone might try to roast it. Walking around it, you couldn't find a single aggressive line or confident angle. Everything was padded, softened, and shaped to be harmless. Instead of appearing futuristic, the Aurora looked like something a child might build out of pillows. Inside, things were no better. Because so much of the body was thick, rounded safety padding, the cabin ended up surprisingly cramped. The dashboard was enormous and cushioned, extending so far outward that it seemed determined to occupy half the front seat. The seats themselves were big and soft, but positioned awkwardly, making it feel like sitting in a padded booth at a diner. Headroom was odd, shoulder room was limited, and visibility felt like looking out of a fortress window. Ford wanted the interior to be a safe cocoon, but it ended up feeling like a padded cell that rolled. Driving the Aurora only reinforced the strange impression. The car was heavy, not just a little heavy, but the kind of heavy that makes every bit of acceleration feel like dragging a stubborn sofa across a thick carpet. The engine had to work hard just to get the bulky body moving, and once up to speed, the Aurora floated and wallowed on its suspension like a couch on soft springs. Steering required constant correction, as if the car never quite settled into a straight line. Drivers described the experience as piloting a slow, oversized living room chair that refused to hurry. Even gentle turns made the Aurora lean dramatically, reminding everyone that safety padding adds weight, and weight has consequences. Despite all this, Ford truly tried to make it a pioneering machine. The Aurora had safety ideas that would later become standard. Energy-absorbing structures, improved seatbelts, better crash protection, and thoughtful interior layouts. In a way, the prototype was decades ahead of its time. But wrapped in that thick, marshmallow-like shell, the message got lost. Test drivers emerging from the car didn't talk about the innovations. They talked about how warm, slow, and awkward it felt, how the bulky body blocked their view, how the whole vehicle seemed better suited for a museum exhibit than a public road. By the end of its testing, Ford quietly stepped away from the concept. They learned valuable lessons, and many of the safety features eventually appeared in later production models. But the Aurora itself was simply too peculiar to survive. It existed for a moment, puffed up like a giant white sofa on wheels, then disappeared into Ford's archives as a curious experiment. Today, the 1964 Ford Aurora safety car is remembered fondly by older enthusiasts who appreciate its intentions and laugh gently at its appearance. It represents that brave, awkward phase in automotive history when safety was still new, when engineers were willing to build strange, padded, heavy prototypes just to push the idea forward. A giant marshmallow it may have been, but it was a marshmallow that helped move the whole industry towards safer roads.
The 1966 Dodge Diora II prototype stands as one of those unforgettable curiosities in American automotive history. A machine that looked as if it had materialized from a child's sketchbook of the future rather than a designer's blueprint. It was Dodge's attempt to take the small, forward-thinking Diora pickup concept of the early 60s and push it even further into the realm of science fiction, a wild experiment in rethinking what a utility vehicle could be. From the very first glance, it was clear that conventional ideas had no place here. Instead of traditional side doors, the Diora II featured a front entry cabin. The entire nose of the vehicle lifted upward like the lid of a giant refrigerator, revealing a tiny forward control cockpit. It was both impressive and intimidating, a design that made practical entry feel almost ceremonial.
People who saw it at auto shows often laughed and shook their heads, but they couldn't stop staring. Getting inside was a ritual in itself. Test drivers would open the nose, duck under the sweeping front section, navigate their legs past protruding instrument panels, and finally lower themselves into the small seat while hoping they didn't bump the canopy as they leaned in. Closing the nose back into position was another careful step. If not done correctly, it could rattle or fail to lock properly. Observers joked that by the time a driver had completed this entrance, the trip was already over. Every aspect of entering the Diora 2 made it clear that this vehicle was meant to dazzle, not commute, and certainly not compete with conventional trucks or even passenger cars in daily usability. It was a car built as spectacle, a rolling proof of concept designed to capture imagination rather than practicality. Inside the cockpit, the experience only heightened the surreal quality of the vehicle. The forward control seating meant the driver was perched unusually close to the windshield, almost as if standing at the bow of a ship. The tiny cabin offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the road, but it also felt exposed and oddly cramped at the same time. Every panel rattled, every vibration from the road seemed exaggerated in the compact forward section, and the odd weight distribution gave the car an unpredictable feel at even modest speeds. Driving it required a level of patience and care that few conventional vehicles demanded. One tester reported said that steering the Diora Q was like pushing a tool chest on a tightrope, while another joked that a crosswind could lift the car off the asphalt if not for the gravity of common sense. Performance was secondary to aesthetics. The Diora 2 rolled on a shortened Dodge pickup chassis with a simple V8 engine under the hood. But the car's radical forward control design and unusual bodywork changed how it handled. The nose-heavy layout combined with its low-slung but elongated form created strange handling dynamics. Gentle cornering made the car tip perceptibly toward the outside of the turn, while braking required careful anticipation because the forward cockpit made it easy to misjudge momentum. At higher speeds, the tall front canopy caught the air like a sail, subtly pushing the car sideways. It was functional enough to roll forward, yes, but it behaved like a playful, slightly rebellious sculpture more than a road-ready vehicle. Despite all its quirks and obvious impracticality, the Diora 2 captured hearts and imaginations wherever it appeared. It represented the height of 1960s design bravado, a willingness to throw out the rules, explore asymmetry, and prioritize vision over function. Its fiberglass body gleamed under show lights, its futuristic profile looked like something from a comic book, and the upward-lifting nose made it instantly recognizable as a concept unlike anything else on the road. Older enthusiasts still remember the sensation of seeing one in person, a small but striking reminder that cars didn't always have to be sensible to be admired. The Dodge engineers eventually accepted that no ordinary consumer would tolerate the cumbersome entry, the awkward balance, or the quirky handling for daily driving. Only one Diora 2 was ever built, preserved as a prototype and a statement of creative daring. But in its eccentricity, the Diora 2 told a story about the era itself, an America caught between the practical realities of post-war life and the limitless optimism of the jet age, a culture willing to imagine vehicles that were part car, part spaceship, and entirely thrilling. It became a rolling legend, a testament to the idea that some cars are not measured by how far they travel or how fast they go, but by how completely they capture the imagination of everyone lucky enough to see them in motion. Even today, collectors and car historians look back at the Diora 2 with fond amusement and awe. It's a car that embodies a philosophy rare in modern automotive design, that beauty, creativity, and audacious innovation can outweigh practicality, at least for a moment. It reminds older enthusiasts in particular of a time when car makers weren't afraid to ask, "What if?" and to turn that question into a sculptural, rolling dream, awkward entry and all.
The 1970 Chevrolet XP882 electric prototype occupies a special place in the annals of automotive history. A car that represents a moment when ambition raced far ahead of technological reality. In an era when muscle cars dominated the American imagination, roaring down highways with throaty V8s and billowing exhaust, General Motors quietly embarked on a project that looked decades forward, an electric-powered passenger vehicle. The XP882 was designed to be sleek, low, and futuristic, with body lines so smooth that it seemed to almost glide over the pavement even when stationary. The designers imagined a world where cars would no longer cough fumes, where families could drive quietly through cities and suburbs without contributing to smog, and where innovation, not horsepower alone, would define the automobile. It was a vision so far ahead that most onlookers couldn't even begin to grasp it. At first glance, the XP882 seemed ready to rewrite the rules. The exterior was an elegant wedge, long and low with sweeping lines that hinted at both aerodynamics and grace. Every surface was designed to suggest motion, as if the car had been caught mid-flight. The cabin was intentionally minimalist, a quiet, focused environment where the driver could experience the efficiency of electricity without distraction. Gauges were few and precise, with a digital-style readout that hinted at technology that would not become commonplace for decades. Seats were low and snug, designed to cradle the occupant, while the car delivered a near-silent acceleration unlike anything most people had ever felt. At auto show previews within GM, visitors were stunned. Some even compared it to a lunar rover or a space-age concept more than a street-ready car. Engineers took pride in the aesthetic achievement. In style and ambition, the XP882 was flawless. But the prototype was doomed by the limitations of the era's battery and electrical systems. The pack powering the car was experimental, heavy, and volatile. Every time the engineers pushed the XP882 beyond gentle demonstration speeds, the batteries overheated and the electrical components struggled to manage the current. Wires fused, insulation melted, and warning systems flashed incessantly. One demonstration in particular became notorious. The car was on display before GM executives and engineers when the battery wiring literally began to smoke and partially melt. Test drivers jumped out, technicians fanned the system with emergency airflow, and the room was filled with a mix of panic and disbelief. It was a terrifying and humbling moment, a reminder that, despite brilliant design and forward-thinking engineering, the technology simply could not keep pace with ambition. Driving the XP882 was an exercise in delicate handling and constant vigilance. With no modern thermal management systems, even a brief run caused heat to build rapidly in the battery pack. Test drivers had to accelerate gently, brake with caution, and avoid extended runs. Yet the car itself, when it performed, was a revelation. Its electric drivetrain produced torque instantly, delivering a smooth, whisper-quiet surge that was unlike anything an internal combustion engine could offer. Observers described it as magical, a car that could glide across pavement without sound, responding to the slightest input as if the driver were conducting an orchestra. But each demonstration was a tightrope walk. Push it too hard, and the fragile electrical systems reminded the crew of the limits of current technology. The internal layout reflected the careful thought that had gone into the car, even if it couldn't be fully realized in operation. Batteries took up significant floor space, forcing the cabin to be compact and carefully arranged.
Weight distribution had to be constantly monitored, otherwise the car could handle unpredictably. The low seating position, smooth floor, and minimal interior padding created a sense of intimacy, almost as if the driver were sitting inside a delicate piece of engineering art rather than a road-going vehicle. Even minor vibrations were amplified by the lightweight structure, making it clear that while the car was a vision, it was not yet a practical machine. After repeated heating incidents, including the infamous wiring meltdown, Chevrolet executives quietly made the decision to retire the prototype. The XP882 was never publicly displayed again, and references to it disappeared from internal documentation. Engineers were left to reflect on the lessons it had taught. Early battery technology was far too unstable for practical daily use. Heat management would become a major challenge for electric vehicles, and society simply wasn't ready to embrace a car without an internal combustion engine. Yet, despite its failures, the XP882 was not forgotten by those who worked on it. It was a glimpse of the future, a glimpse that hinted at the silent revolution electric vehicles would eventually bring decades later. Today, the 1970 Chevrolet XP882 electric prototype is remembered as a hauntingly beautiful what-if in automotive history. It represents a moment when GM dared to imagine a world without gasoline, when engineers and designers reached for a vision that was decades ahead of its time. Though the car itself was fragile, volatile, and impractical, it captured the imagination of everyone who saw it. It is a reminder that innovation often precedes practicality, and that some of the most inspiring machines are those that fail spectacularly, yet plant the seeds for a future that eventually catches up. For enthusiasts and historians, the XP882 remains a symbol of ambition, creativity, and the daring spirit of an era that dreamed far beyond what the technology of the time could deliver. A car that silently promised the future and quietly taught the world patience.
The 1973 AMC Amatron was a bold, curious experiment that looked like it had rolled straight out of a futuristic comic strip. A tiny bubble-shaped electric car designed to explore what the world might look like if Americans embraced small, zero-emission vehicles long before the term eco-friendly existed. From the very first sketches, AMC wanted to prove that a car could be compact, light, and electrically powered while still offering a glimpse of the future. It was a two-seat pod, rounded and bulbous, with smooth curves that made it appear almost toy-like. Designers imagined city streets lined with Amatrons, zipping quietly between stoplights, filling a niche no other manufacturer had yet dared to touch. In theory, it was brilliant, a lightweight, efficient electric car that promised innovation at a time when gas-guzzling muscle cars ruled the roads. But the reality of the Amatron was a harsh reminder of the technological limits of the early 1970s. The car's battery pack, made of lead-acid cells, was monstrously heavy, heavier than the rest of the tiny vehicle combined. Engineers later admitted that moving it felt like pushing a brick with wheels attached. Even when it ran, the range was painfully limited, only about 50 miles under ideal conditions, a number that dropped sharply with any real-world use, including climbing hills, carrying passengers, or driving at anything above a slow city pace. The car had barely enough room for two thin adults, and even they had to squeeze their legs and arms into a cabin that felt more like a cramped cockpit than a comfortable interior. Older test drivers recalled the experience as charmingly odd at first, but soon unnerving, because any deviation from perfectly flat, smooth streets made the tiny pod feel unstable. Performance was another limitation. Acceleration was sluggish, almost dreamy, and the car's handling was awkward due to the unusual weight distribution. With so much mass in the batteries, the Amatron's center of gravity was oddly positioned, making it tip and sway during even minor turns. Test drivers reported a constant sense of imbalance, as if the car were negotiating the road with exaggerated caution on its own. Braking required long distances, steering was heavy at low speeds, and any gust of wind could push the bubble car slightly off course. It was a fascinating design experiment, but one that clearly could not survive real-world conditions. AMC engineers quickly realized the Amatron's limitations were not just inconvenient, but potentially hazardous. While the idea of a small, city-focused electric car was admirable, the battery weight, minimal range, and cramped interior made the vehicle unsuitable for everyday use. The risk of someone getting stranded in traffic, running out of power far from a charging source, or simply being uncomfortable and exhausted after a short trip was too high. Practicality trumped novelty, and AMC wisely shelved the concept before it could ever reach showrooms or the general public. Only one prototype was built, and it quietly faded into the archives, a small, rounded testament to both ambition and restraint. Yet despite its failures, the Amatron left a mark on automotive history. It represented an early attempt to rethink the car entirely, decades before electric mobility became a global concern. It reflected AMC's willingness to experiment with radical ideas, to imagine a future beyond gasoline, and to confront the technological hurdles head-on. For enthusiasts who remember it, the Amatron is a nostalgic curiosity, a tiny, delicate bubble car that promised innovation but was far ahead of the batteries and engineering of its era. It reminds us that sometimes the most visionary vehicles are also the most impractical, and that foresight often arrives decades before the world is ready to follow. In hindsight, the Amatron is a charming, almost whimsical symbol of early electric car experimentation. It captures the spirit of a time when engineers dared to dream, even if the roads themselves weren't ready to receive such dreams. The bubble-shaped pod, fragile and heavy as it was, still evokes the sense of possibility and imagination that defined automotive ingenuity in the 1970s. A tiny pioneer, quietly waiting for the day that electric cars would finally become viable.
The 1978 Chrysler Turbine Reborn concept is one of those machines that perfectly embodies the clash between human imagination and the stubborn reality of physics. It was Chrysler's second major attempt to breathe life into the idea of a turbine-powered car, nearly 15 years after the original 1963 turbine car had stunned the public with its futuristic whine and jet-like promise. The original had been a conversation piece, a showpiece, and a bold experiment, but ultimately impractical for mass production. By 1978, engineers believed technology had caught up with vision. Advances in metallurgy, fuel delivery, and materials promised that a turbine car could finally be refined enough for everyday driving. Chrysler called the project Turbine Reborn, and internally it was treated as a statement. Here was a company willing to challenge decades of automotive convention, daring to put the car of the future back into the hands of engineers and potentially consumers. On the outside, the Reborn looked purposeful, almost aggressive, with a long, low hood, aerodynamically sculpted fenders, and minimalist styling that suggested speed and precision. Unlike the original turbine car, which had a certain bubble-like showpiece charm, this car looked serious, a machine built not only to be seen, but also theoretically to be driven. Inside, the cabin reflected this focus. Clean lines, utilitarian gauges, and ergonomically placed controls aimed to give the driver a direct connection to the unique turbine power plant humming just beneath the hood.
Seats were firm and supportive, meant to keep the driver planted during sudden bursts of acceleration, while the dashboard bore indicators far different from the standard tachometers and speedometers, tracking turbine RPM, temperature, and exhaust flow. Even a casual observer could tell that this was no ordinary sedan, and the atmosphere inside the cockpit carried a strange tension, part excitement, part anxiety, because the engine under the hood didn't behave like anything else on the road. The turbine engine itself was a marvel of engineering and a headache in equal measure. Smaller and lighter than a conventional V8, it promised smooth, continuous power without the vibration of pistons, yet it demanded exacting attention. Starting the engine was an ordeal. The ignition sequence required precise timing and a careful hand on multiple levers and switches. Unlike a conventional car, you could not simply turn a key and go. Once started, the engine did offer an almost otherworldly acceleration, a fluid surge that felt more like lifting off a runway than pushing a car forward. But the moment the engine idled or struggled with throttle input, it betrayed the same temperamental nature that had doomed its predecessor. Drivers noted a harsh lag between pedal and response, while the engine itself emitted an unsettling metallic whine that cut through the cabin like a jet preparing for takeoff. It was thrilling in theory, uncomfortable in practice. One of the biggest challenges was heat. Turbine engines run hot even under ideal conditions, and the Reborn was no exception. Mechanics who worked on the car often compared it to a small aircraft in terms of danger. Every panel, wire, and component was sensitive to temperature. Short bursts of driving could make the engine compartment scalding to the touch, while prolonged idling risked damaging insulation and components. One engineer reportedly joked that if you left the car on a sunny lot too long, the turbine would attempt to cook lunch instead of drive. Cooling systems were a constant concern, and no amount of ducting or shielding could fully compensate for the incredible energy density of the engine. Even moving it slowly around the parking lot felt like handling a machine too powerful for its own skin. Performance was simultaneously impressive and frustrating. On a straightaway, the Reborn could sustain speeds that rivaled conventional muscle cars of the era, with a smooth, constant thrust that seemed unending. The acceleration curve was different, though. It lacked the initial punch of a V8, building slowly at first, then suddenly surging as the turbine reached optimal RPM. This made city driving unpredictable. Traffic lights and stop signs became challenges. Pushing the pedal too early or too late could result in hesitation or abrupt power delivery, testing the patience and reflexes of any driver. Handling was conventional, but the combination of weight distribution, heat, and power delivery created a unique driving experience. It demanded focus, care, and above all, respect for both the car and the machine at its heart. Despite the Reborn's limitations, Chrysler pressed on with testing, driven by ambition and the desire to demonstrate what might be possible. Engineers believed in the turbine concept not merely for novelty, but as a potential solution to fuel economy, emissions, and reliability. Unfortunately, the practical realities were unforgiving. Noise levels were higher than expected, starting sequences were slow and fussy, heat management was a constant concern, and everyday driving conditions revealed the machine's inherent vulnerabilities. After repeated trials, the decision was made to quietly shelve the project. Turbine Reborn would not be mass-produced. Only a few prototypes survived, carefully tucked away in Chrysler's archives. The failures, while disappointing, were instructive. They underscored the gulf between imagination and practicality, and highlighted the lessons engineers would carry forward for decades. Today, the 1978 Chrysler Turbine Reborn concept exists in automotive lore as a monument to audacity and experimentation. It was a car that dared to defy convention, to ask engineers and the public alike to imagine a world powered by jet-like technology, and to confront the limitations of materials, fuel, and human expectations. Older enthusiasts remember it as a dramatic, noisy, and temperamental machine that was more aircraft than automobile, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. It may have failed as a consumer vehicle, but it succeeded as a symbol of ambition, creativity, and the willingness of American engineers to push the boundaries of what a car could be. The turbine reborn reminds us that innovation is rarely comfortable, often impractical, and sometimes downright dangerous, but it is always exhilarating to witness. It is a roaring, metallic testament to the era when the future seemed just within reach, if only you had the courage to grab it.